Good evening and welcome to the first Next Up of the new year. And Alvin Reid of the St. Louis American and I are so very excited and grateful to welcome to the program Dr. Michael Kinch. He is an Associate Vice Chancellor at Washington University in St. Louis, where he helps lead entrepreneurship activities as well as research on innovation in biopharmaceutical research and development. He founded and leads CRIB, the Centers for Research Innovation in Biotechnology and Drug Development, and he is at the forefront of the COVID-19 discussion. Dr. Kinch, welcome back to Donnybrook. It's great to have you.
Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be back.
Where are we today on January 6th, 2021? Were you surprised by the speed with which Omicron presented itself?
I was, frankly. We had gotten used to comparatively slow viruses, and this will probably go down as one of the fastest viruses that's ever, at least from a pandemic standpoint, hit the world. And so this thing is moving very, very rapidly, far more than I think any of us anticipated.
Doc, we find ourselves, like say, 11 months, I guess, after the vaccine. I wouldn't say it was readily available, I guess, in late January, early February, but it was around. Did you think we would still be having the big discrepancy in number of people who are vaccinated and the heated argument about vaccinations that we are now? If you could have predicted like a year from now, are you shocked that we're still at this point too?
Sadly, a year and a half ago, I think maybe with Wendy, we were talking about the fact that this is what we should be anticipating.
Okay.
Because unfortunately, history has taught us that every single vaccine that has ever been introduced has met with resistance. And so it didn't surprise me. And I remember having a conversation in November of 2020 in which the question was, is there going to be a fight to be first in line for the vaccine? And I responded with, I think there's going to be a fight to be the last in line for the vaccine. And that's what history has taught us. There's always a suspicious element that doesn't want to get vaccinated. What has surprised me is the politicization of this, in that you can almost predict who's not getting vaccinated based on who they support and their political candidates. And that's something that frankly is very, very dangerous. And that's the one true disappointment that we have not been able to break through to.
In your book, Between Hope and Fear, the history of vaccinations, is there one thing that one component of the place we find ourselves in today that is just so eerily reminiscent of something historically that you cover in the book, that you are finding yourself thinking, oh, wow?
Every single chapter rhymes with what's going on now. Wow. And every chapter sort of deals with a different aspect of vaccines and vaccine rejection. When I started off to write the book, I had no intention of writing a book about vaccine rejection. It just sort of evolved that way because when you start looking at the history, we see again and again and again. So what we're seeing today is exactly what happened in the 1840s in New England, in different parts of England, Old England, I guess, and other places around the world when the idea of a mandate for a smallpox vaccine came out. There was rioting in the streets in, I believe it was New Hampshire, Massachusetts, London, Petersburg, a number of other places. And it's because, frankly, vaccines, and we've talked about this, I know, in this show in the past, are two things. Two things really characterize vaccines. One is that most people don't understand them. And this has been particularly problematic with the mRNA vaccines because it's a new technology and everyone knows it's new. And so they're frankly afraid of it. And the second part that compounds the problem is that vaccines are given to people that are feeling just fine at the time. They're healthy, they're not worried about disease, and they think they're never going to get the disease. And the issue is that you've got to convince that population you're really susceptible. And even the headlines of the last few years haven't done that. We have lost, and I know I am a broken record on this particular statistic, but we have lost not only more soldiers and civilians than we lost in the American Civil War, just in the United States, to COVID-19, but we have lost more Americans in the past 2 years than have ever died in combat since 1775. Not only that, we're looking at doubling that number if we continue on the current rate that we're at. And so this is crazy. We're going to very likely lose a million Americans before this pandemic is over. And the other frustrating part of this and terrifying part of this is it's not over yet. When Omicron's done, it's not the last one. There will be others.
Okay. Well, Doc, I started school in 1965, kindergarten. Okay. And we all got vaccinated. Now, I think it was my parents and everybody else's parents was like, okay, you're getting vaccinated because whatever my thoughts are on it, it would be worse to get mumps or to get measles or to get all of the things that we're vaccinated for. I guess polio, we got a vaccination, but that had pretty much been, eliminated, at that time. Why was I guess the generation before mine, my parents, why were they willing without fight? And some probably did, I don't know, but for the most part, willing without fight to just say that you're getting vaccinated. All right. And the schools had not really gotten to the point to have to start like saying, like, look, you're not coming through these doors if you're not vaccinated. We just all got vaccinated. What's the difference?
I think there are two major things that jump out. The first is that our parents remembered infectious diseases. They lived through polio. We've gained a hubris in thinking that we're not going to be brought down by any infectious diseases. We've got antibiotics and we've got antivirals and we've got a plethora of vaccines, and this isn't going to be a problem. And that evolved into really the second problem, which is that we allowed anti-vaxxers to kind of dictate the situation. And, when in doubt, blame California, because I believe it was in around the same time period in the 60s to 70s when California said, okay, conscientious objectors to vaccination can allow their kids to go to school without this being mandated. They can avoid the mandate due to religious exemptions or otherwise. And frankly, that was a tremendous mistake. It was the consummate slippery slope, because we've seen more and more people opt out. And they're not opting out because of sincere religious beliefs. They either don't trust the system or there's some other problem that they basically don't believe in the authority. And that's something that I think is really important to point out, is if you look historically, there are the far left and the far right both share a rejection of vaccines. This is not a Republican problem. This is not a Democrat problem. This is a problem with populations of people that don't trust authority. And that has historically been the far left and the far right. And if you look at, and I don't want to promote this crazy person's views, but one of the top books in the country right now is written by RFK, talking about how vaccines are a plot against us and that Tony Fauci is trying to murder everyone. He shares basically the exact same views as Donald Trump on the right. And so you have, in this case, a strange marriage of politics, but they do share a lack of trusting authority.
Dr. Kinch, could you help us understand why that? I think when we first heard the stories about Omicron, and granted, this was very recently, so it's probably still developing in your world, in your community of colleagues. But when we first heard about it, it was mild symptoms. So I'm a believer that people, I'm not worried about that, mild symptoms. I'll go to the grocery store. What's next? They hear mild symptoms. They didn't hear the second part of the story, which was that the hospitalizations would skyrocket, and that's what we can't have. Can you help us understand why, if the symptoms are mild, why are we still so worried about swamping the hospitals?
So there's a couple things. First of all, this disease, COVID-19, is really has two components to it. There's the virus that does the damage, but then there's also, in some people, an overreaction of the immune response, which causes the body's defenses to basically work against us. So we don't yet, and that immune response problem is probably contributing to long COVID, which I think everyone's probably heard of, and probably contributing to a lot of the real damage. And the reason that we know this is that there are some steroids that can suppress the immune system that can help some COVID patients. So we made a tremendous mistake by saying this is comparatively mild, because the key word in that sentence is comparatively. This is killing people, and this is killing lots and lots of people. The comparatively is if you've been fully vaccinated, you don't really have a whole lot to worry about unless you're immune compromised, unless you are undergoing or have recently undergone chemotherapy or other immune suppressing medications. Then it's a bit more dangerous. But for vaccinated, this isn't going to be the end of the world. For unvaccinated, this is going to be a Holocaust, frankly. And this is going to kill people that don't have to die. And that's what's so maddening about it. It's also going to kill, again, our susceptible populations, the elderly and others. And it can be avoided, or could have been avoided, through vaccination. If we were at the stage now where people would take this seriously and say, I'm going to get vaccinated, you're probably out of luck at this point, because Omicron is moving so fast that you're probably going to get infected before your vaccine can kick in at this point. A week ago, I think you'd have been fine. And that's, again, what is so maddening about this. But I'll sort of project forward. Let's hope this history tells us, and history will know in the next few months. Let's assume this is relatively or comparatively mild. There are other variants that are sitting out there right now. There's a variant in Cameroon that has even more mutations that might resist vaccine. This isn't over. And frankly, the only way this ends is for everyone to get vaccinated, because we're going to allow these mutations to keep being created so long as the virus has some food to feed on. And the food it's feeding on are the unvaccinated. The unvaccinated give it an incubator to select for the nastiest form that it can. And until we get control of this, and when I say control, we have to do this in the United States, we have to do this in Missouri, but we also need to do this globally. And so sub-Saharan Africa, which is being underserved with vaccinations, we need to be rushing them as much vaccine as we can get to them. And if Americans aren't going to take it, give it to the folks who want it and need it. But ultimately, this doesn't end until the vaccine-resistant population, in fact, in this case, resistance not being a biological thing, but a psychological thing, until we either induce mandates or otherwise require them to become vaccinated, or frankly, until they die off. And if we select for more and more dangerous versions, it's tragic, but we're going to lose a lot of people prematurely.
Is it still true that the overwhelming majority of people who are hospitalized and maybe ultimately passing away are unvaccinated people? And what is that? If you could, a ballpark percentage, maybe, what is that? If 100 people are in the hospital, and let's say with the Omicron variant, what percentage of those are probably unvaccinated?
I've heard numbers ranging from 86 to 95% of hospitalized are unvaccinated, and the remaining percentage are those who, again, have a weak immune system because they're elderly, they've undergone therapy and other situations. There's also another death rate, and we're going to need to stop thinking in terms of who died of infection, but we're going to need to think in terms of what's called excessive deaths, because you're going to have people you're going to see, I guarantee, because history has taught us this, you're going to see a pretty significant increase of heart attack deaths, cancer deaths, COPD, emphysema, whatever you want to call it. All the ailments that are problematic normally are going to be exacerbated by the fact that people are not going to go see their doctors. The emergency rooms are swamped. A higher percentage of car accident, gunshot victims are going to die because we have a double problem. The emergency rooms are filled, and our incredible medical professionals out there are burning out, and they're burning out at an unprecedented rate.
Well, just this week, BJC announcing at least the first hospital system locally to announce that they are canceling elective surgeries. and that was not surprising, but I think that speaks to the point that you're making, Dr. Kinch. And because this is such a rapidly evolving story, uh, walk us through this debate over testing. Is it is what should we be doing? There are people, including, if I'm not mistaken, the CDC, saying that testing. I mean, where are we today?
Unfortunately, the CDC, 2 years running now, has not been as reliable of a source of information as they had been historically. The testing situation is really problematic from a lot of angles. One is that Omicron moves so fast that you might test negative this morning and be sick tomorrow from Omicron. And so that's probably what's behind the CDC. I think the CDC is sort of having its own other issues. But from how you and I can respond to this, frankly, unless we lock down ourselves, we're going to get exposed. And so, we're back to ordering meals to be delivered, and my wife calls it being like a shark in a grocery store. Never stop, always be moving. And we're going to have to do this until, again, we can get enough people vaccinated that new variants go away. I was listening to a report yesterday, and they had the head of medicine at UCSF, and he was saying all of this is going to be behind us by mid-February. And I hope that that's right. But that only talks about Omicron. And we know from Delta and Alpha and soon to be Omicron that there's going to be a pi and a rho and an omega. And it's just going to keep going on and on and on until we get the vaccination rates to the point where the virus can't mutate anymore. And that's really what I think we need to emphasize.
And so one of those, like say mutations, could it just be like worse? Instead of, the first thing was like mild symptoms with Omicron, but could one come barreling in that's worse? And then, you hate to put it in those terms, but like it hits and it's wiping people out who aren't vaccinated. Do you think that would move unvaccinated people to kind of not be so dug in?
I think experience and history teaches us that at some point it becomes akin to a religious belief. And you can show them all the data in the world and they're not going to come around. And at that point, you have two options. You leave them to their own fate, or you mandate vaccination, or they don't come out in society. And you're starting to, hear conversations and see actions being taken amazingly in places like France. Now, let me put it in some perspective. France historically has been anti-vaccine and very much everyone should do their own thing. If you followed the news in the last 36 hours, the French president basically said, we want to, sorry for the language, we want to piss off all the unvaccinated and require them to become vaccinated by essentially excluding them from living public life. And as hard as that is to hear and to think, well, no one should be allowed to do that, that's what it's going to require, because we've allowed this thing to escape again and again and again. This is like Friday the 13th, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we keep letting the hero live, or the villain live, and we need to do away with them so that we aren't having pi, rho, delta, or pi, rho to omega and beyond.
Dr. Kinch, you said that, and several articles have pointed out that Omicron is not only making people sick, but revealing underlying illnesses that people were not aware of. Could you explain that to our viewers? Why that's so important? It's the doctor that was quoted in this article said that people are getting much sicker in much more profound ways. That, as you said, it's mutating in the variants. Why is that something that the medical community is so keenly interested in watching?
Think of the outbreak as being like the savannah in Africa, and you've got a predator that's going after a pack of animals. It's going to start chasing them, and it's going to find the weak one and weed out the weak one, right? Omicron is revealing that people that maybe had other underlying conditions that exacerbates Omicron's basically weeding them out. The danger is you can also think of, so that's one bad analogy, and I'll follow it with a second bad analogy. Omicron is the predator and we are the prey, and it's eating us. And there is a competition and an evolution occurring with the virus at a remarkably fast level, because viruses evolve at thousands, if not millions of times faster than people. So what you're going to find is that if Omicron's eating the weak, then Pi or Rho or some future virus is going to be able, the only way it's going to be able to get its food, which is us, is to work on the little bit stronger ones and a little bit stronger after that. The only way we can fight that is through vaccination. And the great news is the vaccines are still working. The horrific news is that if we allow these mutations to keep building, we're going to give the virus more and more chance. Think of playing a lottery. We're giving the virus more and more chances to play the lottery and to hit the winning number that now allows it to break into vaccinated populations. Then we're in huge trouble.
Alvin, just one quick follow-up, Dr.
Sure.
Kinch. So the people who are listening, who are thinking, oh, I've had my booster, I'm golden. I don't have to wear a mask. I don't have to worry about what the county council just did. Please address that mindset.
If you're vaccinated, you can still carry the virus. You won't carry it as long. You won't make nearly as much virus as an unvaccinated person. So if you kind of use my lottery analogy, you're creating fewer lottery tickets. However, you are creating lottery tickets, and you will spread those lottery tickets by not wearing a mask. I've been kind of preaching this for more than a year and a half now, which is that we blew it on masks in our communicating about masks. Masks are not to keep you safe. Masks are to keep the people around you safe. And so if you truly care about your neighborhood, your community, wear a mask. It's the most selfless thing that you can do. The decision not to wear a mask is, I would argue, about the most selfish thing you could possibly do.
All right. Now, I had read, I don't know, a month or so ago, there's work being done on some type of vaccine that you could just take orally, vaccine pill or whatever. I don't know how big the percentage will be of people who just don't want to get a shot, just hate getting shots, okay? And if there were a pill, do you think that would bring any kind of sizable population over to the other side? If you said, just take it, just take the friggin' pill and be done with it. Do you think that would help?
I don't.
Okay.
Again, it's akin to a religious conviction. Plus, we actually have an experience for that. And an experience that a company I used to be involved with was a company called MedImmune. And they made an intranasal vaccine. You would squirt up your nose because a lot of people were scared of needles. It didn't change the bar as far as people that would get flu vaccination. So I don't think even a pill would do that. What the pill would be useful for, if it worked, would be to get to all of those underserved populations in Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. It could help get those folks vaccinated. And then someday, when we get the rest of the world, most of the 7 billion vaccinated, we have to come back to a reckoning that those who choose not to get vaccinated are the vaccine farms that are creating the the virus mutations, the virus farms that are creating the virus mutations that are going to lead to the next variant. And until we nip that in the bud, this is going to be, unfortunately, I'm going to be on in 6 months and a year and a half. And no one wants to see this face anymore on TV.
We are very grateful to that face for sharing all of this helpful information. There has been another, at least online social media situation that you're seeing where people are saying that the throat is now, or the throat should be considered rather than the nasal testing, swabbing the throat. Are you even aware of that? Or, I mean, does that have any validity?
I'm not, and so I can't attest to either way to its validity, but it does raise an important point that social media is the world's worst source of information about anything that is science-based or objective, because unfortunately there are lots of people out there to make money and most of them are finding ways to do so by creating some wacky things. So I don't know specifically if that's accurate or not.
But you did say that the involvement in the lungs that you're seeing with Omicron is very different. How?
Um, the involvement of the lungs appears to be higher up in the lung as opposed to deeper in the lung. Now, on one hand, that's great news because deeper in the lung, it tends to give a more severe infection. The problem with the higher in the lung is that it increases the transmissibility because it's easier for the virus to get the higher in the lung. So there's a correlation there. But again, just because it's less severe doesn't mean you're not going to die. And if you haven't been vaccinated, you are at very high risk of being hospitalized or dying or getting long COVID or any number of other things. It's also really important to point out that we know from other coronaviruses, because about 16% of the common cold, what we call the common cold, is a coronavirus infection. You can be infected by that virus year after year after year. Your immunity is very short term. So folks who are walking around saying, I had COVID back in, June of 2020, I'm clean now. I can protect myself. Not based on history, not based on fact. You are just as susceptible as you were in June of 2020.
A little less than 2 minutes left. Bring us some good news, Dr. Kinch. Is there any as we close it out?
But the best news is the vaccines work. Mm-hmm. I mean, we were given a gift that is keeping millions, billions of people alive and healthy that otherwise might not be so healthy and might not be alive. That is the best news. That if you had told me in the March of 2020 that we would have a vaccine that even after all these variants was still working this well, I'd have said, no way. There's not a chance in the world we would get that lucky. We can't forget that. That's the key takeaway from all of this is we mobilized and it worked. The bad news is we run the risk of squandering it, and we shouldn't squander this incredible gift, this blessing that we have been given.
So it could be a lot worse.
It could be infinitely worse than it is.
Should we be back in our bubbles?
That's a personal decision. If you've been vaccinated and you don't need to be outside or be amongst other people, I wouldn't be.
Okay. Well, Dr. Kinch, thank you so much.
Donnybrook is made possible by the support of the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation and the members of 9PBS.